We are in the last section of chapter 2. Chapter 2, the title of it is The Person and Love. And there were three sections. In the first section, we looked at love metaphysically, like what is love, what are the different aspects of love. The second section, we looked at love psychologically, like what do we experience, what do we feel, what's going on within us when we experience love. In the third section, today's video is going to be about the ethical analysis. What should love be? Like, how should we live out love and how should we understand love? And so it's very important to understand what love should be. The first section, subsection of the ethical analysis of love is experience and virtue. And so the basic point of this particular section is that rather than just looking at our experience, when we experience love and just stopping there, we have to really pay attention to love as a virtue. How do we live out love as a virtue? What does love as a virtue look like? Not just paying attention to experience of love. The author, Pope John Paul II, begins by talking about situationism and explaining why it's wrong. Situationism is pretty much you're looking only at the situation at hand and our experience of that situation, and we're ignoring everything outside of it. So, for example, you've heard of situation ethics, like in this scenario, when this and this is going on, what would you do? If there's a train and there's, like one person and it's going, you know, and then there's five people on the other track and it's going that way, like, should you divert the train? And I don't know. And when it comes to more other issues such as abortion, if a woman has uh, abortion, she was raped, and and she might also die, and all these tragic things, that is right or wrong. So in those situations, it's because if you're only paying attention to how you feel and what your experience is, it's hard to really more clearly think about what the right principles are, because you're only looking at experience and our feeling of that situation, and so really ignores virtue and important principles by which we can determine what's good and what is bad. And this is where a sense of duty comes in, and he talks about this next. So, sense of duty is this feeling that we ought to do something, and we ought to do something according to some norm that leads us to good. And this is important because unless we act in a way where we're acting in accordance to certain principles, then we're just acting based on our feelings or just our own opinions. And the norm which our actions should be based on is the gospel commandment to love. And so we're always thinking about our sense of duty. How should we act? How ought we to act? And this is important in our discussion of love as well. It's not that the psychological aspects of love are not important. Our experience of love, our feelings, all of that's important, but left alone, it's without direction, and it's not going to mature into something good or beautiful or truly something of love. In fact, it could degenerate into something that's very selfish and harmful even for the other person and for myself. And so there has to be an ethical completeness. And ethical completeness as in, we have to always take our feelings and experience and always raise it to the plane of how should we act? What should we do with this? And so love as experience should be subordinated to love as a virtue. And when we look at love as a virtue, it's something divine, something supernatural. And so it's hard to really observe everything about it, but there are certain things about it that we can articulate, and that's what today's video is about. And the first thing is a very important point, which is the next section titled The Affirmation of the Value of the Person. Affirmation of the value of the person. So this is a very important section. So what this does not mean is this is not about affirming the qualities of another person. It's kind of helping their self-esteem. Like, this is wonderful about you. I affirm what you're doing. I mean, there's a place for that, but that's not what this is talking about. So, in this context, affirmation of the value of the person is referring to, especially in the context of love and sexuality, recognizing that the other person I'm interacting with is a human person. Reminder of chapter one, meaning it's a person that's supposed to be treated with love and never to be merely used as a means to my end or as an object of my pleasure. And that person has an interiority, their own thoughts, desires, choice, hopes, struggles, and recognizing and having reverence for that. That's what affirmation of the value is. This is important. And in this discussion, he brings in John Paul II brings in the comparison between humans and animals again. It's obvious that humans and animals are different and humans are superior. And in normal context, that's a given. But think of what happens in the sexual context. What How animals practice sexuality and humans do. For animals, they follow their sexual instincts. Everything they do is based on a drive. And and they procreate. And that's the function that it serves in animals. And so let's say that this is their level of how they practice sexuality. The way humans, if we're truly superior, it should be something beyond, procreation, but not just procreation and not just based on our instincts and sexual drive, but something of love, something born of love, something in which two are giving themselves to one another, wanting to raise a child together, participating in God's creation. And so it should be something greater. But in many cases, it turns into something less than that of animals, just pleasure, almost like recreation and using each other. And so, the act becomes degraded. And so what's needed is an integration of our sexual feelings and experiences into a complete love. And a very important component is the affirmation of the value of the person, affirming that the other person is a human being, needs to be treated with love, examining myself to make sure I'm not just using that person, respecting everything going on within that person. And when we affirm the value of the person, he says he names two things that will happen. And the first is having self-control over our sexual desires. And so it doesn't just become, like an animal act or something of pleasure or using the other person. We gain control over our sexual desires because it's ordered towards another person that we're treating with love. And the second thing, which I thought was very interesting, was um, it leads to a choice of one's principal vocation in life. So it leads us to, when we love a person and recognize that that person is a person to be treated with love, it leads us to really think about our whole life and what we're called to do in life. And this becomes discussed later in the book. This next section is membership of one another. And so this takes us back to what was introduced in the section we read about betrothed love under metaphysical analysis. So it's when the man and woman, give themselves to the other. And so what does that mean? So as a human, we are masters of ourselves. We're free. Nobody's supposed to force us to act against our will. I mean, God doesn't even force us to love him. But when two people, love each other in the sense of betrothed love in marriage, they freely choose to surrender themselves to the person that they love. So if I get married, I'm surrendering my will, I'm surrendering myself to the person that I love. And when that's mutually present, when two people truly, give themselves to the other, that's when the sexual intercourse is a bodily expression of this self-giving of the wills that's present. Um, this kind of fills in what was discussed earlier. Uh, he mentioned about how love exists as experience within two people, but there's an objective sense of love as something that exists between the two people. And so, what is that? What is that? What does that mean? And so, this is where we can fill that in a little more. Two people mutually giving themselves to each other, and there's a, unification through that love and self-giving, the gift of self. And of course, this is, distinct from the emotional aspects of love, which are within the two people, and but that can lead to the self-giving that exists between them. And that's the more objective aspect of love. The affirmation of the value is, mentioned again, and this is something that has to be there in order for love to be there, but also in order to be able to give and receive properly. Because when I'm aware of the great value of that freedom, interiority, what a human person is, when I'm aware of all that, that's when I'm truly aware of what I'm giving up and what I'm receiving. Okay. So unless we recognize the value of what's being given up and what's being received, then we're not truly receiving and giving. And so that awareness of the value of a person and what I'm giving up and what exists in the other person, that's very important part of love. Next section is titled Choice and Responsibility. And the author himself, Pope John Paul II, says that this has the most direct connection to the book, which is titled Love and Responsibility. And simply put, and I'm quoting here, the greater the feeling of responsibility for the person, the more true love there is. And so when you feel responsible for a person, then that's a sign that love is present. But this isn't just about feeling responsible for the person, but understanding why, where that sense of responsibility comes from. And I think that's key, because if somebody gives you like $5, I mean, yeah, there's some sense of responsibility for it, but not really. If somebody gives you their life savings, then there's a great responsibility. Wow, this is a big gift. I have to use it right. But if somebody were to give you the gift of himself, gift of herself, his free will, his soul, his heart, then far, far, far greater is the responsibility. And so it's understanding the sacred responsibility that really makes us aware of what love is. And so he asked the question, what is it that draws two people together? Why do people make this choice to give themselves to another person? And there are the sexual values and all of that, but he says in the end, the value of the person must be the primary reason for that choice. So it goes back to the affirmation of the value of the person. Recognizing the person I love is a person to be loved, person with an interiority, her own thoughts, feelings, desires, hopes, dreams. Really paying attentive to what's going on within that person, knowing that I'm supposed to love that person. So that recognition leads to making myself a gift for that person or the other, and that's a choice that leads to true love. So if it's just based on sexual values and attraction, that's not going to mature into true love, because it stays on the level of pleasure and what I like, even if it's an emotional attraction to this masculine and femininity. It becomes about what's pleasing to me or what I like. The emotional aspect, the sensual and the emotional values, it grows weaker. And what happens when that grows weaker? If your love was based on the value of the person and you've made a self gift, then the love is going to grow stronger when the emotional values decline. But if the love was based on the sexual values and the emotional things, and then as that declines, as the feelings and the sensual values decline, then your love, which isn't really love, but it declines, and you're left feeling empty. And emotions and sexual values, not a bad thing. They're a part of love. It leads to love, but it has to be ordered properly. And awareness of that other person's value as a person must remain at the heart of the whole relationship. When the other person's weaknesses, his faults, his sins, when that really comes into light, then that's when the strength of love is really revealed as well. So, it's back to choice and responsibility, the title of this section. There's a great responsibility in choosing to love. When you give yourself as a gift to another person, when you're receiving the gift of the other person's surrender, there's a huge sacred responsibility. And in that love, we love the person for the sake of that person, and not for how they make me feel or the attractions I have to certain qualities. And when we love like that, there's a great responsibility. This next section is titled The Commitment of Freedom. And I'm sure it's pretty obvious that love has to be free. It can't be forced upon us. And as we've discussed, even God doesn't do that. And so there's freedom in love. A couple of quotes that give us insight from the book. Freedom exists for the sake of love. Why? What are we supposed to do with freedom? We're supposed to love with it. Not use our freedom to selfish ends. And freedom is a means, and love is the end. And so sometimes we think freedom is the end. We just want to be free and do what we want. No, we're supposed to use that freedom we have, and the goal of that is to love. When it comes to sexual values, when we feel it's kind of imposed on us. Like, we're not necessarily choosing it. Like, we choose it once we start feeling these things, but it's not like completely free. It becomes imposed on us. Like, when we see somebody attractive that we like, whether it's just in a physical way or in an emotional way, it's kind of imposed on us. And in those cases, we're choosing some good that impose itself on us in a sense. But something to be truly free, it brings good. He says, not just goods that already exists, but it's capable of bestowing goods from within itself. So rather than just enjoying these goods that I've perceived and I feel, I want to produce good beyond that. And that's where the affirmation, the value comes into place. When it comes to the value of that person's interior life, that person's dignity of not, that then they never should be used, they should be loved, that dignity, that doesn't impose itself on us. We have to truly think about it and choose it, because we don't automatically feel what the other person's thinking or wanting, and we have to choose to give those, be aware of those things and give ourselves to that person. And so that leads us to desire the good for the other, happiness for the other. That's what freedom, freely loving another person and recognizing that other person's value will lead to, wanting the other person's happiness, wanting what's good for them. And if we're aware of our religious values, of course, the greatest good we want for the other person is God. And so in a marriage, that's what we're trying to do, lead each other to heaven. But even somebody who's not religious, the goal is to desire happiness for the other. The last section is called Education of Love. And he begins by talking about the misconception of love as something given. A lot of young people, especially young people, they see love as something complete from the start, which would hinder the integration of love, because if you think something's already complete, then you're not going to work to make it complete. So, that whole idea is if I feel love, that means there is love, and so things will be okay, and I can expect the relationship to be a certain way because I feel love. I've seen it on TV, I see it on other people's Instagram, and so I feel like if there's a certain sense of feeling of love, then it's somehow complete. And of course, theoretically, everybody would say, I know our love needs work and our relationship needs work, but when our love fails or is tested, like we're surprised, like something's really wrong. So we have to be aware that love is, and it has to be seen as something which, in a sense, never is, he says, but always becoming, always growing, always maturing. Okay? So we can't ever be surprised when our love, falls short. So there's a raw material for love, the emotions, the passions, the sensuality, the attraction. But that's raw material, that's not love. And that has to be integrated into something more mature, something more uh, integrated, something more divine. And that's the work of education of love. And he says, great love can only be the work of persons and the work of divine grace. So both are necessary. And we have to work hard at it, but more importantly, we have to really ask God for His grace. And so the point of, I think, this section is to really be aware of our need to grow and not being surprised, when we find out our love is immature. So in this framework, he sets up the discussion for chastity, which will come in the next chapter.